to each and every one of you. Welcome back to our Google Classroom. This time our topic is about classical conditioning in psychology. Behavioral approach. How do rewards and punishments throughout a person's life affect their behavior? The behavioral perspective focuses on observable behaviors that can be measured objectively. Behaviorists believe that our behavior is related to our environment and we can modify behavior by modifying the environment. We learn to associate certain acts with responses they produce. So if my parents want me to stop suckling my thumb, they can cover my thumb in something that tastes bad. Thus, sucking my thumb produces a negative response and will eventually stop doing it. How do we learn behavior? Learning, a relatively permanent change in behavior brought about by experience. Remember the nature versus nurture debate. Learning is what results from nurturing. During this unit, just remember that behavior is not 100% the result of our nurture. For example, you might get better at a soccer as you grow older, not only because you have learned to improve your skills, but also because your body is becoming physically stronger. Stimulus, the definition. An event, sensation, or experience that causes you to react. That is stimulus. Visual stimulus, you see something, you react. Olfactory stimulus, you smell something, you react. Gustatory stimulus, you taste something, you react. Auditory stimulus, you hear something, you react. Kinesthetic stimulus, you feel something, you react. Classical conditioning, a type of learning in which a neutral stimulus comes to bring about response after it is paired with a stimulus that naturally brings that response. Neutral stimulus. This stimulus does not naturally cause the subject to respond in a certain way. Unconditioned stimulus, a stimulus that naturally, no learning involved, causes particular response. Simple definition: learning to associate an automatic behavior or feeling with a stimulus. Neutral stimulus: this stimulus does not naturally cause the subject to respond in a certain way. Unconditioned stimulus: a stimulus that naturally, no learning involved, causes a particular response. The Pavlov's dog experiment. In the 1980s, make that 1890s, Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov was studying aspects of digestive process by observing salivation in dogs. When he made the observation that the dogs began to salivate before the food arrived, for example at that sight of the food tray or sound of the assistant footstep, this work became the foundation for classical conditioning and the behavioral approach to psychology. In this chart, before conditioning, neutral stimulus, when the bell rings, no response for the dog. In the page 2, the dog becomes to salivate as the food or the meat is being presented in front of the dog. This is unconditioned response. Number 3, during conditioning, when the meat or the food presented to the dog, the bell sound first, and then the meat is presented. So the dog began to salivate. And after conditioning, without the meat or the food, only the bell rings, the dog still salivate, even though without the presence of the food or the meat. So this is now conditioned stimulus. When the bell began to ring, the dog expected that there is a food, so he began to salivate. Okay, so that is classical conditioning. Do you think you have been classically conditioned to respond to anything in a certain way? If I hear the sound of an alarm clock, my body becomes tense and my mood becomes unhappy. It is not really the alarm that I want. Classical conditioning. Another example, you need to get a series of shots. The nurse always says, "This won't hurt," before giving you the shots, but the nurse is inexperienced and always gives a really painful shots. Later, before having your teeth cleaned, the dentist says, "This won't hurt a bit," and it causes you the experience of feeling of terror. Ouch. Give me a dozen healthy infants well informed in my own specific world to bring them up and I'll guarantee to take anyone at the random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. A doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, and yes, even into a beggar man, a thief, regardless of his talents, penchants, tendencies, abilities, vocations, and race of his ancestors. J.B. Watson. The Little Albert Experiment. In the 1920s, John B. Watson classically conditioned a human baby to experience fear at the sight of white rats, and as a result of stimulus generalization at the sight of other small furry animals. He achieved this by creating loud, painful noises whenever Albert touches the rat. Albert began to associate small animals with trauma of the noise. That's, very disturbing. Classical conditioning. Simple definition: learning to associate a behavior with a stimulus. Neutral stimulus. This stimulus does not naturally cause the subject to respond in a certain way. Unconditioned stimulus. A stimulus that naturally, no learning involved, causes particular response. After a stimulus has been conditioned to produce a particular response, stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus may produce the same response. The greater the similarity between the two stimuli, the greater the likelihood that stimulus generalization will occur. Stimulus generalization. The greater the similarity between the two stimuli, the greater the likelihood that stimulus generalization will occur. Albert became afraid of all furry animals. The big black dog used in the experiment did. Pair share. What do you think would happen if a dog that had been classically conditioned to salivate at the ringing of the bell never received food? Again, when the bell was rung, in other words, if you keep ringing the bell without giving the dog food, what will result? Of course, the dog will bite you. Extinction. When a previously conditioned response decreases in frequency and eventually disappears. That's right. If you keep on ringing the bell without the food, of course, the dog has a little brain and he will never act again the same way he reacted the first time. Spontaneous recovery. After conditioned response become extinct, the response can sometimes re-emerge after a period of time has passed with no further conditioning. Note that classical conditioning relates to involuntary automatic reactions we have to a stimulus. These are usually emotional and biological reactions. You cannot be classically conditioned to perform a voluntary action. There is a different concept called operant conditioning that refers to ability to make us more or less likely to perform a certain voluntary action. Other examples. Once Jane had a flu. She was eating strawberries and felt nauseated and threw up soon after. Weeks later, she no longer had a flu, but the next time she ate a strawberry, she felt sick again. This type of classical conditioning is called food aversion. Jane learned to associate the feeling of being sick with eating strawberry. Other example. Mark's girlfriend always wore the same perfume, and whenever Mark was with his girlfriend, she made him happy. One day, Mark was shopping and walked through the perfume department. He smelled his girlfriend's perfume and felt happy. Mark learned to associate the smell of the perfume with the happiness he feels around his girlfriend. That's nice. Okay. Other example again. Ben's little brother Lenny likes to torment him by screaming and shooting him with a Nerf gun. That's awful. One day, Lenny screamed but didn't shoot Ben with his Nerf gun, and Ben flinches. Anyways, Ben learned to associate the sound of Lenny screaming with being hit by a dart. This is a good example of conditioning. Naughty boy, don't do it at home. Other examples. Lily grew up in the orphanage where she was neglected and mistreated by the staff. The orphanage was located in a big historic manor house. As an adult, Lily still feels emotional pain when she visits that house because she is associating her negative memories with the place. In fact, Lily feels upset when she goes into any big old house due to stimulus generalization. Well, there will be some times that stimulus can be distinct or extinct. Conditioning in behavioral psychology is a theory that the reaction or response to an object or event, stimulus, by a person or animal can be modified by learning or conditioning. Stimulus response SR theories are central to principles of conditioning. They are based on the assumption that human behavior is learned. Stimulus, a thing or event that evokes a specific reaction in an organ. Response, a reaction as that of an organism or a mechanism to a specific stimulus. Here is the chart on learning is behavior change. And stimulus, response, reinforcement are the triad in the factor of behavior change. There are three major types of learning or conditioning. Number one is learning through association. This is the classical conditioning. Number two, learning through consequences, operant conditioning. Number three, learning through observation. This is modeling or observational learning. What is classical conditioning? It is a learning process that occurs through associations between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. It had a major influence on behaviorism, which is based on the assumption that learning occurs through interaction with the environment. About Ivan Pavlov, born September 26, 1849, he was awarded the degree of Candidate of Natural Sciences 1875 and was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine 1904 in recognition of his work on physiology of digestion. died February 27, 1936. Components of classical conditioning. The unconditioned stimulus, UCS, a stimulus that naturally and automatically triggers a response. The unconditioned response, UCR, the unlearned response that occurs naturally in response to the unconditioned stimulus. The conditional stimulus, a previously neutral stimulus that, when paired with an unconditioned stimulus, triggers a conditioned response. Conditioned response, CR, learned response to the previously neutral stimulus. Here is example. Unconditioned stimulus plus neutral stimulus equals conditioned stimulus. And this is equate to conditioned response. Unconditioned stimulus is also equate to unconditioned response. The principles of classical conditioning: acquisition, extinction, spontaneous recovery, stimulus generalization, and discrimination. Here is Pavlov's experiment. Before conditioning, there is a food and the dog begin to salivate. Unconditioned stimulus is the food and the dog is the unconditioned response. During conditioning, he uses whistle. Before feeding the food, the whistle is blown and the response of the dog is salivation. Unconditioned response still. Before conditioning, whistle, no salivation. After conditioning, if the whistle is blown, there is salivation of the dog. This is called conditioned response. So every time the whistle is blown, the dog will salivate because of the preconditioning. In number 3, this is during conditioning, there is a food smelled by the dog, and when the whistle is blown, the food will be smelled by the dog. So the saliva of the dog began to salivate. Okay. So here is the outline of Pavlov's experiment before conditioning. Food, unconditioned stimulus. Before conditioning, bell sounds. This is neutral stimulus. During conditioning, bell, conditioned stimulus plus food. This is now conditioning, unconditioned stimulus, UCS. And after conditioning, the bell, conditioned stimulus, and the response, there is salivation, unconditioned response. During conditioning, salivation, unconditioned response. And after conditioning, salivation, still conditioned response. Types of conditioning. Of course, when neutral stimulus appears just before and during presentation of unconditioned stimulus. There are 2 types. Delayed conditioning. The CS is presented before the US. It stays on until the unconditioned stimulus is presented. This is generally the best, especially when the delay is short. Trace conditioning, this discrete event is presented in the US occurs shorter interval, the better, but you can tell this approach is not very effective. Backward conditioning. occurs when conditioned stimulus immediately follows unconditioned stimulus. Simultaneous conditioning, both conditioned and unconditioned stimulus occurs and terminates at the same time. This form of conditioning follows a two-step procedure. First, a neutral stimulus comes to signal us through forward conditioning. Then second neutral stimulus is paired with the first and comes to yield its own conditioned response. Temporal conditioning. In temporal conditioning, an unconditioned stimulus is presented at regular intervals, for instance, in every 10 minutes. The application of Pavlov experiment. Behavioral therapies. Prolonged exposure theory used for the treatment of phobias and anxiety disorders. It works by exposing the patient to their painful memories with the goal of reintegrating their repressed emotion with current awareness. Aversion therapy. It's a behavioral therapy. Aversive stimuli is paired with an harmful or society undesirable behavior until the behavior becomes associated with pain or discomfort. Here are some basic questions on classical conditioning in psychology. Number 1, what are 3 applications of classical conditioning? Classical conditioning explains many aspects of human behavior. It plays an important role in generating emotional responses, advertising, addiction, psychotherapy, hunger, and etc. Those are the 3 applications of classical conditioning. And what are the basic components of conditioning? Well, the basic components of conditioning process are these: unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, extinction, generalization, and discrimination. Okay, the third question is that why is classical conditioning so interesting? The answer is classical conditioning can help us understand how some forms of addiction or drug dependence work. For example, the repeated use of a drug could cause the body to compensate for it in an effort to counterbalance the effect on the drug. Another example of classical conditioning is known as the appetizer effect. Okay, so next questions. What are the examples of classical conditioning? For example, whenever you come home wearing a baseball cap, you take your child to a park to play. So whenever your child sees you come home with a baseball cap, he is excited because he has associated your baseball cap with a trip to the park to play. Alright, so guys, don't forget at the end of this video, there are some questions posted, and please answer it and send it to our Google email or hand it in our Google Classroom. Thank you. See you on our next lesson.